Hey, what's good, Spirit Squad? So, this is Dre, and today what we're going to be doing is going over a core concept of modern gameplay, and this will also apply to other formats, but I believe it to especially be true in modern. And today's concept is going to get a lot of people a lot of W's, because I believe that this should be focused on more than almost any other concept in modern. And that is going to be sideboarding. Sideboarding is a really important part of constructed magic, mostly because 2 out of every 3 games of magic that you play in a tournament setting are going to be post-sideboard games. So, theoretically, 2/3 of your conversation probably should be talking about post-boarded games, and that's what we're going to do today. Also, there are anything between 50 and 70 decks that you could face at any point in time in a modern tournament, and a format that is that wide, we should probably be talking about how to sideboard for, with, in, against at least some portion of those decks, because there's no way that anybody ever has a perfect plan with 15 sideboard spots to cover 70 different decks. Like, that's just a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to attempt to cover some of that today. And with that, of course, we're going to go ahead and work on developing a plan, and like I said, even if you are not a Spirits pilot, I believe that some of this will still be good content for you, just because sideboarding applies to everybody who plays constructed magic. And like I said, this is doubly important in modern, just because of how wide and huge the format is. So the first thing I generally like to do in modern is group all of the available decks into 5 archetypes. And the archetypes I like to consider are aggro, combo, control, mid-range, and big mana. And a lot of decks will kind of fit in between the cracks, and we'll talk about them too, but they're generally pretty rare. So the first category is going to be aggro decks, and that's going to be where decks like Prowess and like Hammer Time live. Any of the creature-based decks that are looking to simply kill you before you kill them. The combo decks in the format, and these are going to be like Heliod with Infinite Life, like Oops All Spells, and the other decks that are basically looking to just resolve 1 or 2 key spells. And while they are linear in nature, they are very powerful. The next one is going to be control decks, and these are going to be where decks like Uropiles and like blue-white control live. And these ones are going to be the most flexible as far as adapting their game plan to what the rest of the format's doing. Next is going to be mid-range, and these are going to be decks like Jund and like red-black mid-range that are looking to do a little bit of everything with their deck. Sometimes they have fast draws, sometimes they disrupt you, sometimes they can play a control game. Y'all know what the drill is. Jund's been the same for 10 years. And the final category, and this is going to be a modern-specific category, is going to be big mana decks. And these are going to be where decks like Primeval Titan Piles and like Tron live. There are land-based decks in other formats, most notably Legacy, but big mana specifically is a concept almost unique to modern. So, how do you plan with one deck to fight against any / all of these strategies if you're trying to fit 5 archetypes across 70 possible decks with only 15 spots to play with? And my answer to you is usually pick a strategy. And by that I mean that there's generally 3 core sideboarding strategies available to a pilot in any format. And I like to think of them as either adjust, transform, or don't care. And that's basically the I guess the 3 different ways that you can make your sideboard and then apply it to whatever environment you plan on playing in. And of course we'll talk about what I mean by each of those 3 things too. So by adjusting your plan, what I mean is simply playing a bunch of cards that are meant to simply help bolster your already existent game plan by sliding in 1 or 2 cards that cover a few different matchups but aren't necessarily lights out cards against any one matchup. For example, a card like Aven Mindcensor will stop your opponent from searching, but they still get to search the first 4 cards of their deck. However, it costs 3 to play and is a creature, so it dies to removal. This card has the ability to be pretty good against decks like, say, Primeval Titan and like Tron, but turn 3 is a bit of a liability, a creature's easy to remove, and what if they get lucky and hit something in the top 4 cards of their deck anyway? That is what I call kind of like a soft piece of hate. Another like soft piece of hate is probably something like Burrenton Forse-Tender, where yes, it is a little strongly pointed at red decks, but it's a 1/1, which means that creatures can attack through it anyway. If you want to use it to actually stop a spell, you have to sacrifice it, so it only gets to do it for 1 spell. And in the decks that generally want to play an effect like that, having a core wizard is a pretty awkward creature type for Cavern of Souls half the time, so it doesn't really play nicely with other tribal decks or anything like that either. And that's another example of what I would call a soft hate card. And a lot of decks play a bunch of different soft hate cards so that they can have some game against a bunch of different strategies and simply hope that their own gameplay is good enough. And that is actually the approach that I like to use with spirits. So I will often play cards like Aven Mindcensor, like Damping Sphere, like Unified Will, just a bunch of cards that are pretty good here and there across a bunch of different matchups, but aren't necessarily lights out against any of the main strategies that are there. Just here's a strategy that can adjust to a bunch of different decks at any point in time while not totally weakening your own game plan. And that's why I call that plan adjusting. The next style of game plan is going to be transforming. And transforming sideboards do a lot of taking their original game plan and flipping it all the way on its head. So now the opponent has to defeat you on an entirely different axis in order to even really participate because you changed your plan so much. And there are 2 main examples of decks that do this right now. The first one is going to be Oops All Spells, where that deck goes from being an entirely graveyard-based combo deck to being able to not only look for, but also play Goblin Charbelcher out of the sideboard. So now you have to worry about, okay, well, is my opponent going to try to use Goblin Charbelcher at me, or are they going to try to interact with me through their graveyard? Do they have both? And now you have to worry about which of those 2 plans your opponent could be coming at you with. That's a transformational sideboard. Another example of a transformational sideboard is going to be the recent Jeskai control lists that have popped out. And game 1, they're just a pretty hard control deck with like Teferis, Cryptic Commands, other counter spells, removal spells, your basic control game. But in game 2, they have access to cards like Madcap Experiment and Platinum Empyrean. So you can't side out all of your creature hate against this control deck, which otherwise would be a very common strategy, because they could just come at you with an 8/8 as early as turn 4. Well, what do you do about that if you sided out all of your creature removal? So now you're stuck leaving in cards in your deck that are potentially otherwise dead to this Platinum Empyrean, but if you keep in all the cards that beat that, you might not just be able to beat their original game 1 play of like Teferi and friends. So they were able to transform and disrupt your entire strategy because they transformed. So things to look out for. The third option here is going to be don't care. And these are going to be where some decks simply choose to play very, very lights out sideboard cards that entirely hate on certain strategies. And when they do this and they face those matchups, well, sideboard cards are great for a reason. And a lot of these cards are going to be examples like Rest in Peace, like Grafdigger's Cage, like Blood Moon, things that are like Choke is a good example, things that will straight up flip a game on its head, but you have to face the right matchup for them. The downside to things like this is that, well, Modern's like a 70 deck format. If you're playing against, like, say, Uro and Death Shadow and Heliod and all the other decks that are at the top of the meta right now, but in round 1 you face somebody on Jeskai Ascendancy combo, well, oops, your Rest in Peace isn't going to do you too much good against the deck that's playing, like, Stormwing Entity and a bunch of cantrips. So these strategies will pick and choose their spots and simply hope that they call the metagame right, which works a lot of the time because the top part of the meta is the top part of the meta for a reason. So when you do play cards that are actively hating against the best decks in the format, and you play against those decks, you look like a genius. But the downside is that Modern is such a huge format that sometimes this can backfire because opponents will just play whatever they want sometimes. So if you're playing, like, I don't know, say 4 copies of Core Firewalker in your sideboard because you just hate losing to Mono Red Prowess, and then you play against me on Spirits, well, that's not going to do you any good. So you need to just kind of be aware that sometimes when you are choosing these lights out sideboard cards, that you only get 15 spots to play with. And that's kind of the downside of playing very strong cards. But that's going to be a thing that wins you a lot of games, because sometimes you'll just play against Primeval Titan, you'll resolve a Blood Moon, and, well, there's the match. So, you know, you get some very free wins sometimes with the Don't Care strategy. And that is a strategy that a lot of people have employed in the past and will continue to because it is strong. So, for Spirits Pilots, how does that really pertain to us? And what I said before is that my favorite strategy to employ sideboarding when specifically talking about Spirits is the slight adjusting plan. And that's where we want to do things like play a bunch of soft sideboard hate cards so that we can cover as much of the format as possible, because at the end of the day we're still attacking with a bunch of 2/2s, right? So we kind of need to keep our game plan intact. This also means, specifically for Spirits, that I also like keeping my sideboard as full of creatures as humanly possible, for 2 reasons. First off, as a creature deck, we just need to attack. That's just what the plan is. We don't have a plan B. So, like, there's no such thing as us using Jace's ultimate to deck you out, or, you know, us milling you or anything like that. There's no alternate win condition of, like, Thassa's Oracle, which, to be fair, the Merfolk Pilots just got a couple of weeks ago, and that's a sweet one. I kind of wish we had something like that. But we don't, so that's the life you live. So we need to attack. So I like keeping my sideboard just full of creatures so that when I do employ a sideboard plan, I'm still attacking. The second thing we need to know that, you know, what matchups can we afford to kind of skimp on sideboard spots for? So we need to know what sideboards or what matchups are we already good enough against to the point where we don't really need to sideboard more than maybe 2 or 3 cards. And we'll go over some of the matchups that are both good, bad, and what I believe to be even. So for matchups that are actively bad, I think these belong to, like, the Mono Red Prowess decks that play Lava Dart, any of the Primeval Titan matchups, and the Green-White Heliod decks. So, for the Prowess matchups, the reason that I think that these decks are a little bit bad for us is A, because they just play a bunch of spells that can kill 2/2s, and B, they generate card advantage just based on the fact that Lava Dart exists. About a third of our deck at any point in time is usually like just a bunch of 2/1s and 1/1s, so Lava Dart just is a card they already want to play to generate prowess anyway, but it also happens to kill like a third of our deck. So it's just a really, really bad spot for us to be in sometimes. And even when we do side in relatively strong sideboard cards like Core Firewalker, they are already playing Bonecrusher Giant, so we still have to be on the lookout for protection from red to sometimes be ignored due to the text on Stomp. So that matchup I believe is a little bit bad. I do usually like playing cards like Core Firewalker against them anyway, but we just have to be a little careful about what we're doing. I also like playing Path to Exile against them, even though it ramps them up to being able to actually use all of their extra cards that they generate with, like, Seasoned Pyromancer and Light Up the Stage and stuff like that. Heliod, that matchup just... we can manage that matchup if we can manage the card Heliod. Almost the entire rest of their deck is actually not that great against us. Heliod itself, however, sucks, because we have no way to win through Infinite Life. Like, if they get Heliod plus Spike Feeder on the table, that game is over. So I like to specifically keep their creatures off the board. Again, the Path to Exiles will see some play here, but I also currently have one copy of Deicide in my sideboard just to get rid of Heliod. Because if, like I said, if Heliod plus Spike Feeder hits the table, we're done. That's the game. So between the Deicide and our 4 copies of Skyclave Apparition, I generally like to think that's good enough to keep Heliod off the table. So far, it has been. And then Primeval Titan piles are just pretty much always going to be good against us. So we just kind of need to make sure that we're able to either keep Primeval Titan itself off the table or get them down to a low enough life total that when we're in the middle of attacking, a Resolve Primeval Titan isn't enough to save them. And a lot of the time, that's been my plan. So for the past few weeks, I've been playing Aven Mindcensor, and that card's actually done a lot of good. But also you can play things like Aether Gust to make sure that Primeval Titan doesn't resolve even with a Cavern of Souls on the table. We can make sure to play Path to Exile so that cards like Primeval Titan and Dryad of the Elysian Grove never actually get to stay on the table and just do their respective things. Like, there's a lot of play that we actually have to make sure that we can adjust to the big mana plan that they're presenting, but we do need to know what we're doing so that we are able to so that we're actually able to compete against that deck, because it is a bad matchup for us and it is everywhere. But now that we're done talking about bad matchups, because who has time to be negative all day, we have some good matchups in the format too. And these good matchups are a lot of why I love playing Spirits so much. So our primary good matchup in the format happens to be the best deck in the format. And by that I mean the Uro piles. So the Uro piles are going to be like the 3 and 4 color control decks that are just trying to play some mana spells like not Rampant Growth, Growth Spiral. They play like Growth Spiral, they play some Planeswalkers here and there, they play copies of Uro to continue ramping themselves. Uro's also their win condition because Uro's like the best card in every format right now. Flags. And our natural game plan disrupts like half of what they're doing, right? So they're going to try to cast like Lightning Bolt and Path to Exiles at our creatures, but we already play cards like Rattle Chains and Drogskull Captain to counter those. Like, they don't play copies of Supreme Verdict, but if they do have them in their sideboard, we still have cards like Spell Queller and like Selfless Spirit to help get rid of that spell. Both Uro and Omnath can be hit by both Skyclave Apparition and Spell Queller, so those are cards that are their best cards and we naturally have answers for. And their deck is packed with like 15 counter spells. We have Cavern of Souls, so they can cast their remands and their mana leaks all they want in a solid third at a time. We just do not care. And even if we don't have Cavern of Souls, we still have cards like Aether Vial, we have Mausoleum Wanderer to counter the counter spells, and we have Spell Queller to exile the counter spells. So that if we really want a spell to resolve, a lot of the time it's just going to whether they like it or not. And of course, having a good matchup against the best deck in the format is generally a place most pilots would like to be. The next most popular deck is another deck that we have a pretty good matchup against, and that's going to be the Death Shadow decks. So the Death Shadow decks are just going to go ahead and they're going to have their discard, they're going to have their big giant Scourge of the Skyclaves or their Death Shadow, and then we play a Skyclave Apparition and ruin that entire plan. So that's going to be just like a thing we love having access to, right? So they play cards like Dismember to lower their life total, they want to get Death Shadow on the table, but we also want their life total low because we're just going to kill them. And the best part about the Death Shadow matchup is that unless they have Temur Battle Rage, which they only play 2, sometimes 3 of, we can block all of their stuff because all of their stuff are just ground pounders. Like, nothing has evasion, nothing has protection, they're just playing a bunch of big giant threats, right? But all of our stuff flies. So we just get to dictate the rules of combat at pretty much all times. We also get access to cards like Shacklegeist, so if they just want to play like a 10/10 Scourge of the Skyclaves, all we need to do is have 2 spirits, and that threat no longer matters at all. So that tends to be a really, really positive matchup for us, especially when you consider that we just get to bring in Path to Exile from the sideboard. Or if you want to play a more focused sideboard against those decks, you can play things like Auriok Champion, Celestial Purge, whatever you want. Even Teferi Time Raveler is really good here. And then the next really good matchup for us is going to be a pretty popular combo deck. This one's making a comeback, and it's going to be Ad Nauseam Combo. So Ad Nauseam Combo is still just the same deck that it was before, except the format, I'm not going to say forgot about it, but it is definitely starting to put up results again, because the format has to pay even more attention to other combo decks. So Ad Nauseam just kind of gets to sneak under everybody's radar and just do its thing, and right now I think it's actually in a pretty good place. So our natural game plan of just here's a Mausoleum Wanderer, here's a Spell Queller, already happens to interact pretty favorably with what they want to do. So we have Skyclave Apparition to get rid of like their Phyrexian Unlives and their Pentad Prisms and stuff like that. So if we want to make sure they don't get to develop their mana, we can do that. But also, we just get to interact with them on the stack, which is where they're best at. So they get to do things like, you know, Angel's Grace and Pact to Negation and all the other kind of stuff, but we just have like Aether Vial and Cavern of Souls for Spell Queller, and Mausoleum Wanderer just does its thing. And if you are the type who wants to play Teferi Time Raveler out of the sideboard, a quick cool thing about that is that you can use your Teferis when they're trying to do things like suspending their Lotus Blooms, and their Lotus Blooms can literally never come off a suspend. So they just get to just waste a card, whether you decide to actually use your Teferi or not. Just Teferi existing will automatically kill their Lotus Bloom from ever resolving, and that's super nice when it happens. And then we also have a bunch of even matchups too. So a couple of even matchups are just things that we definitely have play against, but we do need to know that these decks exist, so we still kind of should have a general plan for them. And the most popular example that I have of an even deck is probably going to be Tron, because Tron is going to come up a lot. Now, Tron, all of the games against Tron are very, very one-sided in my opinion. But you can, about 50% of those games go to either player. So they can just go ahead and, you know, have natural Tron on turn 3, resolve all their cool things, and you die to all their cool things because they're playing a bunch of big dumb spells, right? But the cool thing about the Tron matchup is that each of their big dumb spells happens to be naturally dealt with by something we already want to play. So if we get our draws to line up even in game 1, then we just a lot of times don't even really have to worry too much about what they're doing, as long as we line up the right answer to what they're doing. So the exception to that rule is going to be Ugin. Honestly, you have one route to beat a resolved Ugin. Play all your stuff with Flash and hope it's good enough. That's your plan. The rest of the plan sucks. But Ugin aside, we can actually deal with just about everything else that the Tron deck is looking to do to you, even when they have 7 mana on turn 3. So check this out, right? So if they play Oblivion Stone, we've got Spell Queller and Skyclave Apparition and Selfless Spirit to make sure that an Oblivion Stone can never just kill our whole team. If they're playing a Baby Karn, then we have either Spell Queller or Skyclave Apparition to just deal with that on the spot. If they're playing a Big Karn, if they try to uptick, okay, fine, give them something worthless out of your hand. If they try to downtick, then we can either Rattle Chains, or if we have a way to play it at instant speed, a Drogskull Captain to make sure they can never remove a key creature with Karn's downtick. If they're downticking to kill a Vial, or they're downticking to kill a land, chances are we're already winning because we should be attacking by that point. What else do they play? Wurmcoil Engine. If they play Wurmcoil Engine, we have access to either Shacklegeist or Path to Exile, or, a cool thing to know, is if Wurmcoil Engine is attacking you and you have a Selfless Spirit in play, cool, life is easy. All you gotta do is block with the Selfless Spirit, and then before damage resolves, just sacrifice the Selfless Spirit, give your team indestructible, and the Wurmcoil Engine isn't going to do any damage, so it's not going to gain them any life. That can sometimes get you a free turn you need to just continue winning and attacking. So let's see, we covered Karn, we covered other Karn, we cried about Ugin. Oh, Ulamog. So if they cast an Ulamog, right, and their plan is to just go ahead and hit 2 lands of yours, chances are you're probably already winning because you should be attacking by that point. But if they're targeting your creatures, it's the same as the other Karn. We can just go ahead and play Rattle Chains or play Drogskol Captain to make sure that trigger never actually resolves. Also, we have Shacklegeist to make sure Ulamog can never actually attack if we need to do that. So, out of the sideboard, though, we get to play things like Damping Sphere, like Ceremonious Rejection. We can play some counter spells. Right now, I think I want to play Unified Will, but we'll see how that goes. Anyway, you have lots of options available to you to fight Tron if you need to. Another matchup that I believe is even is going to be the Hammer Time deck. And the Hammer Time deck is a little weird because it has the ability to get under us just by nature of them being really, really fast, right? All their stuff costs 1 or 2. So we do still have a lot of play against them, though. Skyclave Apparition is super good in this matchup, unless you try to kill the creatures with it. So Skyclave Apparition can just get Colossus Hammer off the table. So we don't need to worry about whether Giver of Runes is doing anything or not, because we don't have to let Colossus Hammer do anything. We can just keep that card off the table, and then the rest of their deck is just reduced to being creatures that are somehow even smaller than ours. So just keep the creatures. A lot of the creatures can do what they want, except Puresteel Paladin. That thing you need to keep off the table. That card sucks. But the rest of the creatures, they can generally just stay where they are, and we can just get rid of the equipment with Skyclave Apparition, and that plan a lot of the time is way more than good enough. But if you don't have exactly Skyclave, then we can still sideboard into like Path to Exile. If you're playing additional copies of spells or Skyclave effects, there's still Deputy Detention to get rid of things. You can play like Phyrexian Revoker to name whichever equipment you deem worthy, or if you're holding a hand of like Path to Exiles but they have a Giver of Runes, you can Phyrexian Revoker or Pithing Needle their Giver of Runes, and now that part of their plan sucks too. We have a lot of interaction. The only thing that you really need to do is make sure that you definitely get to turn 3, though, because I mean, if you don't get to turn 3, you just don't get to play a lot of our interaction, so that's going to be just a really key thing. But other than that, once we get down even 1 or 2 pieces of interaction, life is generally very, very easy for us. Because even when they put an equipment on something, we don't have to care a lot of the time, because we have cards like Shacklegeist to make sure that equipped creatures can never attack. And that's, again, where I wanted to talk about shutting down Giver of Runes. Because Giver of Runes is pretty annoying, but most of the rest of their plan, honestly, really isn't. Just, I don't know, play slow. You're not the fast deck in this matchup, so don't try to race them. Our next matchup that I think is even is going to be like Death and Taxes, right? So Death and Taxes plays a lot of the same plan that we do, and that's in quotes because they do it in a very different way. So that deck has a lot of angles to be able to attack you from, but most of those angles are relatively ineffective against our plan A. So they do have things like Skyclave Apparition that we need to be careful about, but honestly, not too careful, because outside of exactly Giver of Runes, they can't protect their cards from us. We can protect all of our cards from them. So I found one of 2 routes to be effective against them. Either A, just be so fast that they can do nothing about it, and only a few of their creatures fly. So when that plan starts going, there's almost nothing they can ever do to stop it. Like if we put 2 Drogskol Captains on the table at the same time, they have pretty much no way to interact with us. So we don't need to give them options, we just kill them. The second route is going to be using cards like Shacklegeist to actually play like a control style deck against them. Now, this part of the plan sucks against exactly Sword of Fire and Ice, but most of the rest of their stuff that they have, even when they have a Vial on the table, is going to end up being a lot less instant speed and a lot less going to the pace we want to go to. So we can play a slower game, making the game go at our pace, which is usually instant speed. And since we have access to Shacklegeist, then they don't have anything to replicate that kind of board control. We can pick and choose how combat works every single turn until they just get dead. So, like I said, exactly Giver of Runes can mess up that plan a little bit, but we can even do cool things like tapping down Giver of Runes with Shacklegeist because it can't protect itself. And then, once that's done, we can still kind of dictate the rules of combat. It's pretty sweet. Those games are a slogfest, but they generally work out in our favor as long as we stick to the plan. The only real downside there, though, is that if you're relatively new at Spirits and you're playing against almost any Death and Taxes player, note that almost all Death and Taxes players are very good with that deck, because that deck is so hard to play. It's basically like it's basically like a hey, I got my high IQ stamp of honor that they play Death and Taxes and have for the last like 5 years. So just be careful for a Slogfest and assume they always have some kind of trick up their sleeve, because, well, they usually do. But that's going to be one thing to just kind of keep a note about. Like, we have a lot of play against them. And the last deck that I think is even, again, all of these games are kind of one-sided like the Tron games, but it's actually going to be Oops All Spells. So a lot of the games against Oops All Spells come down to whether they can turn to you or not. Because I believe that once turn 2 is out of the way, we have so much interaction that they can literally never win the game after that point. And we have a lot of interaction with that deck, but we do need to make it to turn 3 to even have that. And this is actually going to be a quick screenshot of a game I had against Oops All Spells just the other day, and look at how stacked this hand is. Like, it's turn 107 or some such, but they also have 1,000,000 mana, so we're not going to tap out and just get ourselves dead. But this hand might as well just be called Oops All Responses. So we have near infinite interaction with them, but we need to be able to play very patiently, and I like to definitely aggressively mulligan to hate against this deck. Otherwise, they can and will kill us if they catch us slipping even once. So I actually had a game like a week or two ago where it was insane. They mulled to, I think it was 5 and then 4 and then 5, and turn 2'd me all 3 games. Like, the stuff, it'll just happen to you. So but as long as you're prepared, though, it's really good. So, like, if you put a bunch of counter spells in your sideboard, if you put a bunch of low cost sideboard hate in your sideboard, then I think it's actually a really good thing. And my current go-to for Oops All Spells hate is actually Faerie Macabre, because a lot of the Oops All Spells players have moved up to playing more than one copy of Pact the Negation. So I wanted to play something that was both uncounterable and actually solve the problem, and I think for now that's Faerie Macabre for me. But yeah, we've seen a lot of examples of exactly what plans we have against a lot of the best decks in the format. We've seen all of the different sideboard strategies that exist in this format, and we understand how we are allowing ourselves to, adjust to the format, so that if you want to have a plan against really anything, you can. Just know exactly what your task is as a Magic player and how you plan on applying it. But I'm glad to have this talk with y'all today, because it does mean that hopefully you'll start to win a lot more of your sideboarded games now that we've actually kind of defined what it means to develop a plan as far as sideboarding is concerned. So, as usual, if you do like what you see here, just make sure to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and I'll see y'all on the next one.